sudden turn of events in global trade. Amid escalating tensions between the world's largest economies, the United States is preparing for a decisive move that could reshape global economic ties. Starting in 2025, a 25% tariff will be imposed on all automobiles manufactured outside the U.S., a clear signal aimed at stimulating domestic production. This step, taken by one of the key players in world trade, has caused a wave of questions and doubts among Washington's closest allies, including the European Union and Canada. With trade disputes with China, the second-largest trading partner of the United States, escalating, experts are wondering if it is time for the EU and Canada to reorient themselves towards the vast Chinese market. The new tariff packages introduced in the first week of April appear to be reigniting a trade war, forcing a rethinking of existing economic strategies and a search for new avenues for development. Amidst the tightening of sanctions pressure from the Trump administration, China is offering European and Canadian partners very attractive prospects in the manufacturing and energy sectors. However, a legitimate question arises. Are Europe and Canada ready to reorient their colossal trade flows, estimated at trillions of dollars, from the American market to the Chinese market? The actual trade figures between these countries are thought-provoking. The European Union and Canada have a trade turnover with the United States approaching $1 trillion. Of this amount, about $700 billion accounts for trade in goods and services between the EU and the US, and $300 billion for Canadian-American trade. This prospect causes understandable concern for U.S. President Donald Trump. He urges Americans to be patient, assuring them that the situation will resolve favorably. However, the introduction of global tariffs has not only led to a collapse of the U.S. stock market, but also to a sharp increase in demand for Chinese goods. Since January 2025, the Trump administration has consistently introduced tariff restrictions against China, citing the need to protect national interests. The latest package of measures, announced on April 2nd, is mainly aimed at sectors such as electronics, steel, aluminum, chemical products, and high-tech components. In response to the protectionist measures of the United States, China has declared its readiness to take retaliatory steps, plunging American exporters into a state of anxious uncertainty. Europe and Canada, which have long expressed concern about the damage that U.S. policy is causing to world trade, now seem to be seriously considering closer cooperation with China. Public opinion polls indicate a rapidly changing attitude towards the United States in the countries of the European Union and Canada. A significant majority of citizens, from 55 to 60%, disapprove of the trade wars initiated by Trump, believing that Washington is stifling business with excessive protectionism. The British press actively covers the results of polls on social networks, where many European voters argue that the tariffs imposed by the U.S. administration are harming their exporters and leading to higher prices for goods in stores. A similar picture is observed in Canada, especially after the arrival of the Biden administration, from which a more moderate policy was expected. However, when Trump reintroduces tough tariffs, Ottawa begins to look for new options, fearing that the U.S. arbitrarily changes the rules in each agreement, casting doubt on the stability of trade relations. The public resonance caused by the situation adds additional weight to the arguments that sound increasingly weak and are increasingly leaning towards China. At the same time, China has no intention of abandoning plans to further liberalize its market for the countries of the European Union and Canada. One of Beijing's long-standing strategic goals is to conclude agreements with Canada that open access to its rich energy resources, such as oil and liquefied natural gas. In addition, the Chinese side is interested in establishing joint research and development work with European partners in the field of high-tech products. According to some economic experts, the annual trade volume between China and Europe has already reached an impressive mark of $800 billion, and the prospects for further growth of this indicator with the connection of Canada look very promising. A deepening of both commodity flows and financial cooperation between these regions is expected. In Canadian society, the idea of reorienting the export of oil and liquefied natural gas to the Chinese market, considered as an alternative to the U.S. market, is being actively discussed. Canadian energy sector representatives are increasingly reporting difficulties in selling their products to the United States due to imposed tariffs, while China, on the other hand, is demonstrating enormous demand for energy resources. Similar sentiments prevail among European automakers, who see the Chinese market as an opportunity to offset profit losses associated with American tariffs. Thus, China is gradually strengthening its position as a key economic partner for countries in Europe and North America, offering them new opportunities for development and growth. The company already holds a strong position in the Chinese market, and the question of further expansion naturally arises. European manufacturers are paying attention to the impressive trade volumes between the European Union and the United States, which approached $1 trillion in 2024, specifically $995 billion. Of this, exports from the United States reached $450 billion, while exports from the EU to the United States amounted to $545 billion. To this should be added the trade between Canada and the United States, totaling $42 billion. These figures clearly demonstrate the close economic ties between the two sides of the Atlantic. However, by 2025, the situation had changed. Donald Trump's aggressive rhetoric towards China, as well as his tariff threats to the EU and Canada, have forced European and Canadian leaders to consider revising their strategies. The question of whether to change plans has come to the forefront. In social networks, the idea is increasingly voiced that in the long term, cooperation with China, which offers cheaper production and a huge market, may be more profitable than playing with high risks. The question of whether Canada's pursuit of trade diversification implies a complete abandonment of the United States remains open. Some analysts believe that it is not about a complete break, but rather a strategic reallocation of priorities aimed at strengthening cooperation with China and reducing dependence on the American market. Canada certainly relies heavily on energy exports to the United States, including oil, liquefied natural gas, and electricity. The country's revenue from oil and gas sales in 2024, estimated at approximately $100 billion, mainly came from the American market. However, if protectionist policies, such as tariffs proposed by the Trump administration or other trade restrictions, complicate these exports, Canada may be forced to develop large-scale projects oriented towards alternative buyers, such as China, the European Union, or even Japan. Reorienting to new markets will require significant investments in the construction of new pipelines and liquefied natural gas plants, making this transition very costly. Nevertheless, public opinion polls in Canada show that up to 60% of citizens support the idea of implementing pipeline projects not linked to the United States, expressing fatigue with the trade war initiated by the Trump administration. Opening up to broader global markets is seen by many as being in the country's national interest. The government in Ottawa can count on voter support by presenting trade diversification as a measure to strengthen Canada's strategic independence. In American political circles, there is a belief that Canada, being a major trading partner, will not go anywhere. However, retaliatory measures against Trump's tariff policy are becoming increasingly tough. A similar situation is observed in the European Union, where Germany, a key exporter of cars to the United States, may reorient itself to the Chinese market if high American duties are imposed. Dissatisfaction with the U.S. protectionist policy on agricultural products is also growing among southern European countries. Behind the scenes of European politics, the idea is increasingly voiced that the enormous potential of the Chinese market cannot be ignored, especially in the context of trade instability created by the actions of the American administration. According to some reports, the European Commission is considering a scenario in which the share of the United States in long-term trade forecasts will be reduced, while that of Asian countries will be increased. However, rapprochement with China poses new questions for Europe related to the protection of intellectual property rights and respect for human rights. The question of prioritizing economic gain does not always find a clear answer in the countries of the European Union. While the Trump administration continues to put pressure on China, the possible consequences of the introduction of new tariffs scheduled for April 2, 2025, are being discussed behind the scenes. This involves raising tariffs on Chinese goods to 34 to 50%, which, combined with existing measures, could lead to an astronomical sum of 104%. Such actions, according to the Chinese side, border on an economic blockade. In the European Union and Canada, concerns are being raised that such a sharp tightening of trade policy could trigger a global recession. Against this backdrop, calls for cooperation with China in their own interests, instead of blindly following the U.S. course, are becoming more frequent. According to British media reports, this trend is moving into the practical realm and is being discussed at the government level in EU countries and Canada. Agriculture, the extractive industry, rare earth metal production, automotive manufacturing, and the oil and gas sector, including LNG, are among the most promising areas for cooperation. China already holds a dominant position in the rare earth elements market. Strengthening ties between the EU, Canada, and China in this area could reduce the dependence of the American technology sector on supplies of strategically important raw materials. The economic power of the European Union and the resource potential of Canada make partnership with China increasingly attractive to the Middle Kingdom. The EU, with its population of 450 million and high level of consumption, represents a huge market. Canada, while not boasting the same number of inhabitants, possesses colossal reserves of energy and natural resources, acting as an alternative supplier to the United States. The formation of a trade and economic triangle between the EU, Canada, and China could cause serious concern in Washington, which fears being isolated. It is likely that such a prospect was one of the factors influencing the Trump administration's policy. In social networks, questions are already being raised about what steps the U.S. will take to prevent such a scenario. Washington may try to dissuade the EU and Canada by offering them new, more favorable terms of cooperation. However, given the continuing tariffs and protectionist rhetoric, European and Canadian partners may conclude that it is not advisable to continue trading with an administration that demonstrates instability. Nevertheless, the question of how quickly the reorientation of trade and economic ties will occur remains open. According to analysts, a complete break in economic ties between the U.S. and its traditional partners is an almost impossible task. Trade between the European Union and the United States reaches an astronomical $995 billion, and between the U.S. and Canada, about $400 billion. It is not possible to redirect such volumes of trade towards China overnight, either technically or politically. However, even a gradual shift in emphasis could lead to significant consequences. If European companies start moving production to China, and Canada redirects its pipelines and liquefied natural gas plants to Asian markets, then in 5 to 10 years an economic structure less dependent on the U.S. may be formed. Some commentators on social networks express concern that underestimating Europe and Canada could lead to a long-term loss of market share for the United States. Despite the fact that a complete break seems unlikely due to the strong domestic economy of the U.S. and its innovative potential, even a 10 to 15% reduction in trade could cause multi-billion-dollar damage to the American economy. Experts warn that such changes will not go unnoticed for the U.S. economy. There is a tangible demand in public opinion for a rethinking of international alliances. Sociological studies in Canada reveal that confidence in the United States has been shaken. About half of Canadians express doubts about the reliability of their southern neighbor. At the same time, there is a growing understanding of the need to establish relations with China. Paradoxically, about 70% of respondents believe that a complete break with the U.S. is not possible now. But the diversification of foreign policy ties and the study of alternative options for cooperation seem highly desirable. Similar sentiments are evident in Europe. The trade policy of the Trump administration, especially the introduction of tariffs of 34% and 50%, has drawn sharp criticism in France and Germany. The idea of excessive dependence on the U.S. and the potential risks associated with the unpredictability of American policy is taking root in the public consciousness. There is a growing fear that similar measures may be applied to European partners in the future. Socioeconomic instability only exacerbates the alarming mood. Representatives of various industries, from farmers to manufacturers and importers, are increasingly declaring their readiness to reorient themselves to the Chinese market, which seems to them more predictable and reliable than the American one. This trend could lead to a weakening of the U.S. position on the world stage and a loss of allies. At the same time, the Chinese economy demonstrates high productivity, which makes it an attractive partner for many countries. The opening trade horizons promise many benefits. opportunities are emerging to offer economically attractive alternatives to European and Canadian partners. In the energy sector, particularly in oil and liquefied natural gas supplies, China is ready to provide long-term purchase guarantees, which may be of interest to Canadian companies. Amidst the volatile policies pursued by the Trump administration, Beijing appears to be a reliable partner capable of ensuring stability in commodity trade in the long term. Undoubtedly, human rights issues and differences in political systems are causing criticism from the European Union and Canada. However, if economic considerations prevail, these disagreements may be sidelined, giving way to the pursuit of stable trade. Some analysts predict that China will take advantage of the situation to conclude major strategic deals with the EU and Canada, which are tired of the tensions caused by the trade wars initiated by the United States. This entire situation represents an unexpected twist, becoming a kind of echo of the Trump administration's policy aimed at containing China through the introduction of new tariffs. While the United States seeks to isolate China, the EU and Canada are increasingly leaning towards the idea of cooperating with it for their own benefit. In social networks, a discussion is gaining momentum about the boomerang effect that may arise as a result of U.S. trade policy. Some analysts, using the phrase, "Trump is panicking," point to the risk of alienating Washington's closest allies due to its confrontation with China. Even if the European Union and Canada do not radically reduce their trillion-dollar trade with the United States, redirecting part of these flows towards China could lead to significant financial shifts. Such changes could reshape the world trade map, forming new centers of power in the energy and technology sectors. The question of whether the EU and Canada will prefer closer economic cooperation with China remains open. On the one hand, such a step seems logical from the point of view of market diversification. On the other hand, it is associated with certain logistical and political risks. If the U.S. does not soften its tariff policy and abandon the hard line pursued by the Trump administration, the world could indeed slide into a multi-block confrontation. In social networks, concerns are expressed that such a scenario could trigger a recession. However, there are also those who see positive aspects in the diversification of world trade, believing that it will benefit all participants. Don't miss the opportunity to stay up to date with the latest events. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any important updates. In the coming months, world trade may face unexpected twists, as the European Union and Canada seem ready to implement their ambitious plans to reset trade relations. We are in for a fascinating spectacle, the transformation of the global economy in real time. In the meantime, we say goodbye to you and look forward to seeing you soon in new releases.